Hello friends, welcome to another cozy dive into the wonders of history. Tonight, let's wander together through the serene tale of medieval builders, just ordinary people like us, who with just simple tools, calloused hands, and hearts full of patience, crafted cathedrals that touch the heavens. Picture yourself by a warm fire as we unravel the slow, beautiful process that transformed humble stone and timber into breathtaking monuments of grace and strength, still standing tall after centuries. If this journey sparks your curiosity, hit that subscribe button and join our little community of history lovers. We'd love to have you along for more stories like this. In the dim light of medieval Europe, between the years 1000 and 1500, ordinary people accomplished something extraordinary. They built cathedrals. Not small churches or modest chapels, but enormous stone structures that reached toward the heavens with pointed arches, flying buttresses, and towers that could be seen for miles across the countryside. These buildings took decades to complete, sometimes stretching across multiple human lifetimes, with fathers passing their craft to sons and sons to grandsons, all working toward the same towering goal with patient dedication that spanned generations. The tools they used were simple: hand chisels made of iron, forged in village smithies, and sharpened countless times until they became extensions of the craftsman's hands. Wooden mallets worn smooth by countless strikes against stone, their surfaces polished by years of use. Rope woven from hemp or flax, twisted into strong cords that could bear enormous weights. Pulleys carved from oak by skilled woodworkers, their surfaces smooth and true. Measuring devices made from knotted cords, marked at precise intervals that had been tested and retested over years of use. Stone hammers shaped by blacksmiths in village forges, their weight and balance carefully calculated for specific tasks. These were not the precision instruments of modern construction, but rather the basic implements that humans had been using for thousands of years to shape stone and wood into structures of lasting beauty. Yet with these humble tools, medieval craftsmen created structures so complex and beautiful that they continue to inspire wonder nearly 1,000 years later. The secret lay not in their technology, but in their patience, their skill, and their deep understanding of materials that had been passed down through generations of master builders. This knowledge was not written in books, but lived in the hands and minds of craftsmen who had spent decades learning the properties of stone, the behavior of mortar, and the secrets of structural engineering that allowed massive walls to support themselves while reaching impossible heights. The process began with the selection of stone, a task that required both practical knowledge and artistic vision. Master masons would travel great distances to find the perfect quarries, places where limestone or sandstone lay in thick, even layers beneath the earth. They sought stone that was soft enough to carve when first extracted, yet would harden with exposure to air, developing the strength needed to support the enormous weights that would be placed upon it. The limestone quarries of Caen in Normandy became famous throughout Europe for producing stone that was both beautiful and workable, with a fine grain that could be carved into the most delicate details while maintaining its structural integrity. English builders prized the warm, honey-colored stone from the quarries of Bath, which seemed to glow with inner light when touched by sunlight. French cathedral builders favored the pale limestone of the Paris basin, which provided a perfect canvas for the intricate carvings that would decorate their soaring structures. The master masons understood that not all stone was created equal. They learned to read the layers in a quarry face, understanding how the stone had been formed over millions of years and how these ancient processes affected its properties. They knew which beds of stone would weather well when exposed to rain and frost, and which would crumble under the assault of the elements. They understood the subtle differences in hardness and texture that would affect how the stone could be carved and fitted together. This knowledge was gained through years of experience, passed down from master to apprentice through careful observation and patient instruction. Quarrying was slow, methodical work that required both skill and patience. Workers would split stone along natural fault lines using wedges and hammers, carefully following the grain of the rock to produce blocks of consistent size and quality. They learned to read the stone like a book, understanding the subtle signs that indicated where it would split cleanly and where it might fracture unpredictably. The quarrymen developed specialized techniques for different types of stone, understanding that limestone required different handling than sandstone, and that the same type of stone might behave differently depending on the season when it was quarried. The process of quarrying began with the careful removal of the overburden, the soil and broken rock that covered the good stone beneath. This was done by hand, using simple tools to scrape away centuries of accumulated debris. Once the stone bed was exposed, the quarrymen would examine it carefully, marking the natural joints and fissures that would guide their work. They used iron wedges driven into these natural cracks, splitting the stone along predetermined lines to create blocks of the desired size. The shaping of rough quarry blocks into finished building stones was an art in itself. The masons used a variety of chisels, each designed for specific types of cuts. The pitching tool, with its broad blade, was used to remove large amounts of stone quickly, creating the rough shape of the finished block. The punch, with its narrow point, was used to texture the surface and remove smaller amounts of material with precision. The claw chisel, with its toothed edge, created a smooth surface that could be further refined with flat chisels. The bowster, broader than the punch, but narrower than the pitching tool, was used for intermediate shaping work. Each type of chisel required different techniques and produced different results. The mason learned to control the angle and force of each blow, understanding how the stone would respond to different treatments. The sound of the chisel striking stone told the experienced craftsman about the quality of the stone and the effectiveness of his technique. A clear, ringing tone indicated sound stone and proper technique, while a dull thud might suggest a flaw in the stone or an error in the cutting angle. The transportation of stone presented enormous challenges that required ingenuity and careful planning. Heavy blocks had to be moved from quarries to construction sites, sometimes across many miles of rough medieval roads. Teams of oxen, sometimes as many as 20 animals for a single large block, pulled wooden sledges loaded with carefully balanced stones. The roads of medieval Europe were often little more than muddy tracks, impassable in wet weather and dusty and dry conditions. The transportation of stone required careful timing, with loads moving only when conditions were favorable. Where possible, builders chose quarries near rivers, using barges to float their materials downstream. The great Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris received much of its stone by barge along the Seine, with workers hauling blocks up from the riverbank using nothing but rope and human strength. The loading and unloading of stone barges required specialized equipment and skilled workers who understood the behavior of heavy loads on water. The barges themselves were often specially constructed for stone transport, with reinforced hulls and loading equipment designed to handle the concentrated weight of stone blocks. The journey from quarry to construction site was often hazardous. Broken axles, overturned carts, and injured animals were common occurrences that could delay construction for days or weeks. The medieval builders developed techniques for repairing damaged transport equipment in the field, using materials and tools that could be carried with the transport crews. They also developed methods for recovering fallen stones, using levers and pulleys to lift blocks that had tumbled from their transport vehicles. Once the stone arrived at the construction site, the real work began. Medieval builders understood that a cathedral's foundation had to be deeper and stronger than anything they had built before. Their chisels were made of iron, carefully forged and tempered to hold a sharp edge. They had chisels for rough work, removing large amounts of stone quickly, and fine chisels for detail work, creating the intricate carvings that decorated capitals, doorways, and window frames. The mallet, usually made of hardwood, was the mason's constant companion, its weight and balance carefully matched to the type of work being done. The process of shaping stone began with the rough blocking out of the general form, using heavy chisels and mallets to remove large amounts of material. The mason would work around the block, gradually refining the shape and bringing it closer to the final form. As the work progressed, finer tools were used, with the final surface texture created using the finest chisels and careful, controlled blows. The skilled mason could create surfaces that were perfectly smooth or deliberately textured, depending on the architectural requirements. The creation of carved decorative elements required exceptional skill and artistic vision. The masons who specialized in this work were artists as well as craftsmen, capable of creating complex three-dimensional compositions from flat stone surfaces. They worked from drawings and templates, but much of the creative work was done by eye and hand, with the craftsmen making countless small decisions about the placement and execution of decorative details. Measuring and marking tools were equally important to the success of the construction. Master masons used wooden squares to ensure that corners were perfectly right angles, understanding that any deviation from true would be magnified as the building rose. They employed plumb lines to verify that walls were truly vertical, hanging weighted cords from the highest points of the construction to check alignment. Levels, often made from a wooden frame with a plumb line suspended from the center, helped ensure that horizontal surfaces were perfectly flat. For more complex geometric work, masons used dividers and marking gauges, tools that allowed them to reproduce intricate patterns and measurements with remarkable accuracy. The dividers, made from iron or brass, could be set to specific measurements and used to transfer these measurements to the stone. The marking gauge, with its sharp metal point, could scribe lines on the stone surface that would guide the cutting operations. The templates used by the masons were works of art in themselves, carefully created from wood or thin stone and used to ensure that identical elements were produced consistently. These templates were often reused many times, with the more complex patterns being carefully preserved and passed down from project to project. The creation of templates required the same precision and skill as the final stonework, as any error in the template would be reproduced in every stone cut from it. The creation of the great arches that define Gothic architecture required extraordinary precision and careful planning. Medieval builders understood that a pointed arch could support more weight than a round arch, while also allowing them to build higher walls with larger windows. But constructing these arches required careful planning and skilled execution that tested the abilities of even the most experienced craftsmen. The builders created wooden frameworks called centering, temporary supports that held the arch stones in place until the keystone was set and the arch became self-supporting. The construction of centering required skilled carpenters who understood the forces that would be applied to the framework during construction. The centering had to be strong enough to support the weight of all the arch stones, yet it also had to be designed so that it could be removed without disturbing the completed arch. The wooden framework was often a complex structure in itself, with curved members cut to precise shapes and fitted together with traditional joinery techniques. The cutting of arch stones, or voussoirs, demanded exceptional skill and mathematical understanding. Each stone had to be precisely shaped so that when all the voussoirs were assembled, they would form a perfect arch with no gaps or weak points. The shape of each voussoir was determined by the geometry of the arch, with the angles and curves calculated to ensure that the forces would be properly distributed. Master masons used templates, patterns cut from wood or thin stone, to ensure that each voussoir was identical to the others. The process of cutting voussoir began with the creation of the template, which was made by laying out the full-size arch on a flat surface and determining the exact shape of each stone. The template was then used to mark the rough stone block, with the mason carefully positioning it to make the best use of the available material. The cutting process required multiple tools and techniques, with rough shaping done using heavy chisels and final fitting accomplished with fine tools. The keystone, the wedge-shaped stone at the top of the arch, was often carved with special decoration, marking the moment when the arch was complete and the centering could be removed. The setting of the keystone was a ceremonial moment, often witnessed by the entire construction crew and marked with special rituals or celebrations. The removal of the centering was equally dramatic, as it was the moment when the arch would either stand or fall, depending on the skill of the builders. The construction of ribbed vaults, the soaring stone ceilings that crown Gothic cathedrals, represented the highest achievement of medieval building technology. These vaults were essentially a series of intersecting arches, each supporting the others, in a complex three-dimensional structure that required extraordinary skill to design and build. The builders began by constructing the ribs, the curved stone elements that formed the framework of the vault. These ribs were made from carefully shaped stones, each cut to follow the precise curve required by the vault's geometry. The geometry of ribbed vaults was complex, requiring mathematical calculations that tested the abilities of medieval builders. The ribs had to be designed so that they would meet at precise points, with the angles and curves calculated to ensure that the forces would be properly distributed throughout the structure. The builders used wooden models and full-size layouts to work out the complex geometry, often spending months planning a single vault. The construction of the ribs required specialized centering that could support the curved stone elements during construction. This centering was often even more complex than that used for simple arches, as it had to support multiple curved elements simultaneously. The wooden framework had to be precisely shaped and positioned, with any error potentially causing the failure of the entire vault. The stones used in the ribs were cut to precise shapes, with each stone designed to fit perfectly with its neighbors. The cutting of these stones required templates that captured the complex three-dimensional curves of the ribs. The masons who specialized in this work developed extraordinary skills in visualizing and executing these complex shapes, often working from drawings that showed multiple views of each stone. The spaces between the ribs were filled with lighter stones called infill, creating a continuous ceiling that was both strong and relatively lightweight. The infill stones were often smaller and lighter than the rib stones, but they still required careful cutting and fitting to create a smooth, continuous surface. The pattern of the infill stones was often decorative as well as structural, with the masons creating geometric patterns that enhanced the beauty of the vault. The entire vault system was supported by flying buttresses, exterior arches that transferred the outward thrust of the vault to massive stone pillars built some distance from the main walls. This system allowed the builders to create walls that were much thinner than would have been possible with earlier construction techniques, opening up space for the enormous windows that fill Gothic cathedrals with light. The flying buttresses were marvels of engineering in themselves, requiring precise calculation of forces and careful construction to ensure that they would provide adequate support. The construction of these flying buttresses required careful calculation and precise construction techniques that pushed the limits of medieval engineering knowledge. The builders had to understand the forces acting on the vault and design buttresses that would counteract these forces without adding unnecessary weight to the structure. The buttresses themselves were often decorated with carved details, transforming structural necessity into architectural beauty that enhanced the overall appearance of the building. The design of flying buttresses required understanding of the direction and magnitude of the forces exerted by the vault. The builders used empirical methods to determine these forces, relying on experience and observation rather than mathematical calculations. They understood that the forces varied with the height and span of the vault, and they designed each buttress system to match the specific requirements of the building. The construction of the buttresses began with massive foundations that had to be even deeper and stronger than those of the main building. The buttresses themselves were built from large stone blocks, carefully fitted together with mortar. The flying arches that connected the buttresses to the main building were constructed using the same techniques as the interior arches, with wooden centering supporting the stones during construction. The creation of the great rose windows that illuminate many Gothic cathedrals demanded both structural engineering and artistic vision. These circular windows, some more than 40 feet in diameter, were constructed from hundreds of individual pieces of stone, each cut to precise measurements and fitted together like a giant puzzle. The stone tracery that held the colored glass had to be strong enough to support its own weight while remaining delicate enough to allow maximum light to enter the cathedral. The design of rose windows required extraordinary skill in geometric planning and artistic composition. The builders had to create patterns that were both structurally sound and aesthetically pleasing, with the stone tracery forming complex geometric patterns that could support the weight of the glass while creating beautiful visual effects. The planning of these windows often took months, with full-size drawings created to work out every detail of the design. The stonework for these windows was often done by specialized craftsmen who devoted their entire careers to this single aspect of cathedral building. They developed techniques for cutting the flowing curves of Gothic tracery, creating patterns that seemed to flow like frozen music. The precision required was extraordinary, as any error in measurement or cutting would be immediately visible and could compromise the structural integrity of the entire window. The cutting of tracery stones required specialized tools and techniques that were different from those used for other types of stonework. The curves were often so complex that they could not be cut using simple chisels, requiring the use of shaped tools that could follow the required curves. The masons who specialized in this work developed collections of specialized tools, each designed for specific types of cuts and curves. The installation of the tracery was equally challenging, requiring careful positioning and alignment of hundreds of individual pieces. The stones had to be fitted together with incredible precision, with gaps filled with mortar that was carefully matched to the color and texture of the stone. The completed tracery had to be strong enough to support the weight of the glass panels, while remaining flexible enough to accommodate the slight movements that occurred in the building. Scaffolding presented constant challenges as the cathedrals rose higher, requiring increasingly sophisticated systems to allow workers to reach every part of the growing structure. Medieval builders constructed elaborate wooden frameworks that surrounded the building like a temporary wooden cathedral. These scaffolds were often built directly into the walls, with holes left in the masonry to accept the scaffold poles. As the building rose, the scaffolding had to be continually extended and reinforced, creating a complex three-dimensional framework that required careful planning and skilled construction. The design of scaffolding systems required understanding of the loads that would be placed on the framework and the methods that would be used to transfer these loads to the ground. The scaffolding had to support not only the weight of the workers, but also the weight of the materials being lifted and positioned. The wooden framework had to be strong enough to remain stable even in high winds, yet flexible enough to accommodate the slight movements that occurred in the building as it settled. The construction of scaffolding required large amounts of timber, often consuming entire forests in the construction of a single cathedral. The poles and planks used in the scaffolding were carefully selected for strength and straightness, with different types of wood used for different purposes. Oak was preferred for the main structural members, while lighter woods were used for planking and secondary members. The assembly of scaffolding was a skilled trade in itself, with specialized workers who understood the techniques for creating stable, safe working platforms at great heights. The scaffolders worked closely with the masons and other craftsmen, ensuring that the scaffolding provided access to every part of the building, while not interfering with the construction operations. The roofing of a cathedral required different skills and materials from those used in the stonework below. The steep roofs that crown Gothic cathedrals were typically framed with heavy timber beams, often oak trees that had been growing for centuries before being felled for construction. These roof timbers were joined using traditional woodworking techniques, with mortise and tenon joints secured by wooden pegs. The selection of timber for roof construction required understanding of the properties of different types of wood and the ways in which they would behave under load. The cutting and fitting of roof timbers required specialized tools and techniques that were different from those used in stonework. The carpenters who specialized in this work used axes, saws, and chisels to shape the heavy timbers, creating complex joints that would hold the roof structure together. The work was often done at ground level, with the completed timber framework assembled and then raised into position using the same lifting equipment that was used for the stonework. The roof covering varied by region and by the resources available to the builders. Some cathedrals used lead sheets, which provided excellent weather protection but were extremely heavy and expensive. Others employed stone slabs, which were durable but required very strong timber framing to support their weight. Still, others were covered with ceramic tiles, which were lighter and less expensive but required more frequent maintenance. The lead roofing used on many cathedrals was particularly challenging to install, requiring specialized skills and tools that were different from those used in other aspects of construction. Sheets of lead had to be carefully measured, cut, and soldered together to create a watertight covering. The lead was soft enough to be shaped by hand, allowing it to follow the complex curves of the roof structure, but it was also heavy, requiring strong timber framing to support its weight. The workers who installed lead roofing developed specialized tools for cutting and shaping the metal, including knives for cutting and bones for burnishing the joints. The soldering of lead joints required skill in metalworking, with the workers using special solders and fluxes to create waterproof connections. The installation of lead roofing was often done in sections, with each section carefully fitted and connected to the others. The maintenance of lead roofing was an ongoing challenge, as the metal was subject to expansion and contraction with changes in temperature, and to corrosion from exposure to the elements. The cathedral builders developed techniques for repairing and replacing lead roofing, often requiring workers to perform dangerous tasks on steep roofs at great heights. The construction of the great towers that rise above many cathedrals required the builders to work at extreme heights, using only the simplest of tools. Tower construction was often the most dangerous part of cathedral building, with workers laboring on narrow platforms high above the ground. The builders developed techniques for hauling materials up the outside of the towers using pulley systems anchored to the structure itself, often requiring the construction of temporary wooden frameworks that extended high above the growing tower. The design of cathedral towers required careful consideration of the forces that would act on these tall, slender structures. The builders had to ensure that the towers would be stable in high winds, while also providing adequate support for the heavy bells that would hang within them. The walls of the towers had to be thick enough to provide structural stability, yet they also had to include openings for windows and bell chambers. The construction of towers required specialized techniques for working at height, with the builders developing methods for creating safe working platforms and for moving materials vertically through the structure. The towers were often built around central wooden frameworks that provided support during construction, with the stonework built up around these temporary supports. The bells that hung in these towers were cast on site, often in temporary foundries built in the cathedral yard. Bell making was a specialized craft that required precise control of temperature and timing, with the bronze for the bells melted in furnaces fired with charcoal. The largest cathedral bells could weigh several tons, requiring massive wooden frameworks to support them within the tower. The casting of bells was often a community event, with local residents contributing broken bronze and copper items to be melted down and reused. The design of bell towers required understanding of the forces that would be exerted by the swinging bells, which created dynamic loads that were much more complex than the static loads of the building's other elements. The builders had to ensure that the tower structure could withstand these forces without damage, while also providing adequate sound transmission to carry the bell tones throughout the surrounding area. The installation of bells in the towers required specialized equipment and techniques, with the heavy bells lifted into position using the same pulley systems that were used for stonework. The bells were hung from massive wooden frames that were carefully designed to support their weight while allowing them to swing freely. The tuning of bells required skilled craftsmen who understood the relationship between the size, shape, and thickness of the bell and the tone it would produce. The interior decoration of cathedrals involved countless skilled craftsmen working in stone, wood, and metal, each contributing their specialized skills to the overall beauty of the building. The carved capitals that crowned the columns were often decorated with elaborate foliate designs or narrative scenes from religious stories. These carvings were executed entirely by hand, with skilled craftsmen working for months to complete a single capital. The tools used were simple chisels and gouges, but in the hands of master carvers, these basic implements could create works of extraordinary beauty and complexity. The process of carving capitals began with the rough shaping of the stone, creating the basic cylindrical or rectangular form that would support the arch above. The carver then laid out the design, often working from drawings or from his own knowledge of traditional patterns. The carving process proceeded gradually, with the major forms established first and the details added in successive stages. The subjects of capital carvings varied widely, ranging from simple geometric patterns to complex narrative scenes. Some capitals depicted scenes from the Bible, while others showed mythological creatures or scenes from daily life. The carvers often had considerable freedom in their choice of subjects, leading to a rich variety of decorative themes throughout the building. The tools used for carving were similar to those used for other stonework, but the techniques were quite different. The carvers used smaller, more delicate tools than the masons who worked on structural elements, and they required much greater precision in their work. The surface finishes achieved by skilled carvers were often incredibly smooth and detailed, with textures that seemed to bring the stone to life. The installation of stained glass windows required yet another set of specialized skills that combined artistic vision with practical craftsmanship. The glass itself was made in small furnaces, with craftsmen manipulating molten glass to create sheets of colored material. These sheets were then cut into small pieces and assembled into complex pictorial compositions. The pieces were held together with strips of lead, creating a flexible framework that could move with the building without breaking. The process of making stained glass began with the creation of the glass itself, using techniques that had been developed over centuries. The glassmakers used sand, potash, and metallic oxides to create glass of different colors, with the recipes carefully guarded secrets that were passed down through generations of craftsmen. The glass was formed into sheets by blowing or casting, with each sheet carefully inspected for flaws or imperfections. The cutting of glass required specialized tools and techniques that were quite different from those used in other crafts. The glass cutters used iron tools with sharpened edges to score the glass surface, then broke the glass along these score lines. The precision required was extraordinary, as the pieces had to fit together perfectly to create the desired image. The process of designing and installing a major stained glass window could take several years, from the initial conception to the final installation. The designers, often monks or clerics, would create detailed drawings showing exactly how the window should appear. These drawings were then translated into full-size patterns, called cartoons, which guided the glass cutters and lead workers in assembling the window. The cartoons were often works of art in themselves, with skilled artists creating detailed drawings that showed every piece of glass and every lead line. The cartoons were usually drawn on white surfaces, with different colors indicated by shading or notation. The glass cutters worked directly from these cartoons, cutting each piece of glass to match the pattern exactly. The assembly of stained glass windows was done on large tables, with the pieces laid out according to the cartoon pattern. The lead strips, called cames, were cut to length and shaped to hold the glass pieces. The assembly process required great skill and patience, as hundreds of pieces had to be fitted together perfectly. The joints between the lead strips were soldered together, creating a continuous framework that held all the glass pieces in place. The completed window was installed in sections, with each section carefully fitted into the stone tracery. The installation process required coordination between the glaziers and the masons, as the window had to be properly sealed to prevent water infiltration, while still allowing for the slight movements that occurred in the building. The glaziers used various materials to seal the windows, including putty, wax, and specially prepared mortars. The daily life of cathedral builders was governed by the rhythm of the seasons and the availability of daylight, creating a pattern of work that was closely tied to the natural world. Construction work typically began at dawn and continued until dusk, with breaks for meals and rest. The builders worked through spring, summer, and fall, but winter weather often brought construction to a halt. During the winter months, many craftsmen would work in covered workshops, preparing materials and tools for the following season. The working day began before sunrise, with the craftsmen gathering at the construction site as the first light appeared in the sky. The work was organized according to the tasks that needed to be completed, with different groups of workers assigned to different parts of the building. The masons worked on the stone cutting and installation, while the carpenters built scaffolding and roof structures. The laborers moved materials and provided assistance to the skilled craftsmen. The organization of work was hierarchical, with master craftsmen supervising the work of journeymen and apprentices. The masters were responsible for the quality of the work and for training the younger workers. The journeymen were skilled craftsmen who could work independently but were still learning advanced techniques. The apprentices were young men who were just beginning to learn the trade, often starting with simple tasks like mixing mortar or carrying tools. The tools and materials used in construction were carefully maintained and protected, as they represented significant investments for the craftsmen and the project. The tools were often passed down from master to apprentice, with each craftsman responsible for maintaining his own equipment. The materials were stored in covered areas to protect them from weather, with special care taken to prevent damage to the finished stones and other valuable items. The organization of a cathedral building project was remarkably sophisticated, requiring coordination of hundreds of workers and management of complex logistics. Master builders coordinated the work of hundreds of craftsmen, ensuring that materials were available when needed, and that the various trades worked together efficiently. Record-keeping was essential, with detailed accounts maintained of expenditures, materials, and progress. These records, many of which survive today, provide fascinating glimpses into the day-to-day operation of medieval construction projects. The master builder was responsible for the overall design and construction of the cathedral, making decisions about structural systems, materials, and construction techniques. He worked closely with the clergy and the financial sponsors of the project, ensuring that the building would meet their requirements while staying within the available budget. The master builder also supervised the work of the various craft specialists, coordinating their activities and resolving any conflicts that arose. The financing of cathedral construction was a community effort that often spanned generations, with funding coming from many different sources. Wealthy patrons might donate large sums to fund specific parts of the building, while ordinary citizens contributed smaller amounts according to their means. Guilds and trade associations often funded particular chapels or decorative elements. The church itself contributed through tithes and other revenues, while special indulgences were sometimes granted to encourage donations. The financial management of cathedral projects was complex, requiring careful tracking of income and expenses over many years. The builders maintained detailed records of all financial transactions, including payments to workers, purchases of materials, and donations from sponsors. These records were often audited by church officials or civic authorities, ensuring that the funds were used properly and that the project remained financially viable. The procurement of materials required extensive planning and coordination, as the builders needed to ensure that adequate supplies were available throughout the construction period. Stone had to be ordered from quarries months or years in advance, with the builders estimating their requirements based on the construction schedule. Timber had to be selected and seasoned, while metals had to be obtained from distant sources and transported to the construction site. The training of cathedral builders followed the ancient apprenticeship system, with young men learning their trades through years of practical experience under the guidance of skilled masters. Young men would begin as apprentices, learning basic skills while helping with simple tasks. After several years, they might advance to journeyman status, working under the supervision of masters while developing their own expertise. The most skilled and experienced craftsmen became masters themselves, taking on apprentices and eventually being entrusted with important parts of the construction. The apprenticeship system was carefully regulated, with formal agreements between masters and apprentices that specified the terms of training and the obligations of both parties. The apprentices typically lived with their masters, receiving room and board in addition to their training. The masters were responsible for teaching not only the technical skills of the trade, but also the moral and social values that were expected of craftsmen. The progression from apprentice to journeyman to master was marked by formal ceremonies and the creation of masterpieces that demonstrated the craftsman's skill. The masterpiece was often a complex work that incorporated all the skills the craftsman had learned, created under the supervision of other masters who judged its quality. Only those who successfully completed a masterpiece were admitted to the ranks of the masters, gaining the right to take on their own apprentices and to work independently on major projects. The knowledge required to build a cathedral was vast and varied, encompassing not only practical skills but also theoretical understanding of mathematics, geometry, and structural engineering. Master builders needed to understand not only the practical aspects of construction, but also the mathematical principles that governed structural design. They studied geometry, learning how to calculate the proper proportions for arches and vaults. They understood the properties of different types of stone, knowing which materials were best suited for different parts of the structure. The mathematical knowledge of medieval builders was often more sophisticated than is commonly realized, with master builders understanding complex geometric relationships and proportional systems. They used geometric construction techniques to create the flowing curves of Gothic arches and the complex intersections of ribbed vaults. This knowledge was often passed down through guild traditions, with masters teaching apprentices not only how to perform specific tasks, but also why those tasks were performed in particular ways. The understanding of structural forces was largely empirical, based on observation and experience, rather than mathematical calculation. The builders learned to recognize the signs of structural stress, understanding how loads were transferred through the building, and how different structural elements work together. They developed rules of thumb for sizing structural elements, based on the accumulated experience of generations of builders. The seasonal rhythm of cathedral building was closely tied to the agricultural cycle of medieval life, with the construction schedule adapted to the availability of labor and materials. Spring brought renewed activity as workers returned from winter quarters and quarries reopened after the frost. The spring months were often devoted to preparing materials and organizing the work for the busy summer season. The quarries resumed production, with workers removing the accumulated debris of winter and beginning the extraction of new stone. Summer was the peak season for construction, with long days allowing maximum progress on the building. The warm, dry weather was ideal for masonry work, as mortar set properly and workers could labor comfortably at great heights. The summer months were when the most dramatic progress was made, with walls rising visibly and major structural elements being completed. The builders worked long hours during this season, taking advantage of the favorable conditions to accomplish as much as possible. Fall was a time for completing work that needed to be weatherproofed before winter, with the builders focusing on roofing and other protective elements. The harvest season also brought additional laborers to the construction sites, as agricultural workers sought employment during the slack period between harvest and planting. The fall months were often used for the more labor-intensive aspects of construction, such as moving heavy materials and preparing foundations for the following year's work. Winter itself was often devoted to planning and preparation for the following year's work. with the builders using the quiet months to design new elements and prepare materials. The covered workshops became centers of activity, with craftsmen working on carved elements, preparing templates, and maintaining tools. The winter months were also used for training apprentices, and for the more detailed work that required careful concentration. The tools and techniques used in cathedral building were constantly evolving, with each generation of builders adding refinements and improvements. The basic principles remained the same, but the execution became more sophisticated over time. Later Gothic cathedrals showed advances in engineering that allowed for even taller walls and larger windows, while maintaining the structural integrity that had been achieved in earlier buildings. The builders learned from their successes and failures, constantly refining their techniques and developing new solutions to structural challenges. The evolution of lifting equipment was particularly notable, with the simple pulleys and ropes of early construction giving way to more sophisticated systems of wheels and counterweights. The great wheel cranes became larger and more powerful, capable of lifting heavier loads to greater heights. The builders also developed new techniques for anchoring and operating these devices, improving both their efficiency and their safety. The development of new stone-cutting techniques allowed for more complex and delicate work, with the builders creating increasingly elaborate decorative elements. The tools themselves evolved, with improved metallurgy producing chisels and other implements that held their edges longer and cut more precisely. The understanding of stone properties also improved, with the builders learning to work with new types of stone and to achieve better results with familiar materials. The social impact of cathedral building extended far beyond the construction site itself, transforming entire communities and regions. These projects provided employment for hundreds of workers over many decades, supporting entire communities of craftsmen and their families. The skills developed in cathedral building were transferred to other types of construction, improving the quality of secular architecture as well. The concentration of skilled craftsmen in cathedral towns often led to the development of other industries, as the same skills that were used in stone carving could be applied to metalworking, woodworking, and other trades. The economic effects of cathedral construction rippled throughout medieval society, creating demand for raw materials, transportation services, and finished goods. The quarries that supplied stone for cathedrals often became major industrial enterprises, employing hundreds of workers and developing new techniques for extraction and processing. The transportation of materials created opportunities for carters, bargemen, and other transport workers, while the concentration of workers at construction sites created markets for food, clothing, and other necessities. The cultural impact of cathedral building was equally profound, with these projects serving as focal points for community identity and pride. The construction of a cathedral was often seen as a reflection of the spiritual health and worldly success of the community, with citizens taking pride in the beauty and grandeur of their building. The long duration of cathedral projects meant that they became part of the fabric of community life, with generations of families associated with the construction work. The completion of a cathedral was a momentous event that often took place decades after construction had begun, creating celebrations that brought together entire regions. Many of the workers who had started the project had died of old age by the time it was finished, while others had moved on to other projects. The final ceremonies, marking the completion of a cathedral, were elaborate affairs that brought together the entire community to celebrate the achievement. These celebrations often included religious services, civic ceremonies, and popular festivities that lasted for days. The legacy of medieval cathedral building extends far beyond the buildings themselves, influencing architectural practice, construction techniques, and social organization for centuries to come. The techniques developed by medieval craftsmen influenced architectural practice for centuries to come, with the principles of Gothic construction being adapted and refined in later periods. The organizational methods used to coordinate these massive projects provided models for other large-scale construction efforts, from castle building to the construction of civic buildings and private residences. The training systems that produced skilled craftsmen became the foundation for the guild system that dominated European crafts for hundreds of years. The apprenticeship system developed for cathedral construction was adapted for other trades, creating a framework for technical education that persisted into the modern era. The standards of craftsmanship established in cathedral building influenced expectations for quality in other areas of production, contributing to the development of European craft traditions. The preservation of these ancient techniques has become increasingly important as modern conservators work to maintain and restore medieval cathedrals. Understanding how the original builders worked helps modern craftsmen repair damage and replace deteriorated elements in ways that are compatible with the original construction. This has led to renewed interest in traditional building methods and hand tools, as conservators seek to match the skills of their medieval predecessors. The conservation of medieval cathedrals requires craftsmen who understand both traditional techniques and modern conservation principles. These specialists must be able to work with historic materials while using contemporary knowledge of structural engineering and materials science. The training of conservation craftsmen has become a specialized field in itself, with programs that teach both traditional skills and modern conservation theory. The study of medieval construction techniques has also provided insights into the capabilities and limitations of pre-industrial society. The fact that these enormous and complex structures could be built using only human and animal power, along with simple tools and machines, demonstrates the extraordinary potential of human organization and skill. The cathedrals stand as monuments not only to religious faith, but also to human ingenuity and perseverance. The analysis of medieval construction has revealed sophisticated understanding of structural engineering principles that were not formally codified until centuries later. The builders' empirical knowledge of how buildings behaved under load was remarkably accurate, allowing them to create structures that have survived for nearly 1,000 years. This practical knowledge was often superior to the theoretical understanding available to later architects who relied on mathematical analysis. The mathematics underlying Gothic architecture has fascinated scholars for centuries, revealing proportional systems and geometric relationships that demonstrate the advanced mathematical knowledge of medieval builders. The builders used sophisticated geometric principles to design structures that were both beautiful and structurally sound. The proportional systems they employed created harmonious relationships between different parts of the building, while the structural systems they developed allowed for unprecedented height and openness. The geometric principles used in Gothic design were based on simple mathematical relationships that could be constructed using basic tools. The builders used techniques such as the construction of regular polygons and the division of circles to create the complex curves and intersections that characterize Gothic architecture. These geometric construction techniques were passed down through guild traditions, with masters teaching apprentices not only how to perform the constructions, but also understanding their underlying principles. The structural analysis of Gothic cathedrals has revealed that medieval builders understood principles of load distribution and structural behavior that were not formally described by engineers until the 19th century. The flying buttress system, for example, represents a sophisticated understanding of how loads could be transferred through a building, while minimizing the weight of the structure. The builders achieved this understanding through careful observation and experimentation, developing empirical rules that proved remarkably accurate. The environmental impact of cathedral building was significant, requiring the extraction of enormous quantities of stone, the felling of vast forests for timber and scaffolding, and the consumption of great amounts of fuel for lime kilns and metalworking forges. Entire hillsides were sometimes quarried away to provide stone for a single cathedral, while the timber requirements could denude forests for miles around the construction site. Despite these environmental costs, the durability of the structures means that many cathedrals have provided centuries of service from their original materials. The transportation of materials for cathedral construction created some of the earliest large-scale transportation networks in medieval Europe. The need to move heavy stone blocks over long distances led to improvements in road construction and the development of specialized transport vehicles. The water transport of materials led to improvements in barge design and the development of port facilities specifically designed for handling stone and other construction materials. The fuel requirements for cathedral construction were enormous, with lime kilns consuming vast quantities of wood or charcoal to produce the lime needed for mortar. The metalworking required for tools and hardware also consumed significant amounts of fuel, with smithies working continuously to produce and maintain the tools needed for construction. The environmental impact of these activities was felt over wide areas, with forests being managed specifically to provide fuel for construction projects. The acoustic properties of Gothic cathedrals were carefully considered by their builders, who understood that these buildings would be used for singing and spoken services. The proportions of the interior spaces, the materials used in construction, and the placement of hard and soft surfaces all contributed to the acoustic environment. The result was spaces that enhanced the human voice, allowing both speech and music to be heard clearly throughout the building. The design of cathedral acoustics was largely empirical, based on the builder's experience with other buildings and their understanding of how sound behaved in enclosed spaces. The builders learned to create spaces that would support both the spoken word and musical performance, understanding that different types of services required different acoustic properties. The hard stone surfaces of the cathedrals created reverberation that enhanced musical performance, while the careful proportioning of spaces ensured that speech remained intelligible. The lighting of cathedral interiors was another important consideration that influenced many aspects of the design. Before the advent of artificial lighting, these buildings had to function using only daylight and candles. The large windows that characterize Gothic architecture were designed not only for their aesthetic effect, but also to maximize the amount of natural light entering the building. The placement and sizing of windows were carefully calculated to ensure that adequate light reached all parts of the interior throughout the day. The understanding of natural lighting was sophisticated, with the builders considering not only the amount of light, but also its quality and direction. The colored glass of the windows filtered the light, creating interior environments that changed throughout the day as the sun moved across the sky. The builders learned to use this changing light as part of the architectural experience, creating spaces that were transformed by the movement of light and shadow. The construction of cathedral foundations often revealed archaeological evidence of earlier buildings and settlements, providing insights into the history of the sites. Many cathedrals were built on sites that had been occupied for centuries, sometimes incorporating elements from earlier structures. The excavation of cathedral foundations has provided valuable insights into the history and development of medieval towns and cities, revealing layers of occupation that span centuries or even millennia. The archaeological work associated with cathedral construction was often informal, with the builders simply noting and sometimes preserving interesting finds. However, the deep foundations required for these buildings often revealed significant archaeological deposits, including remains of Roman buildings, early Christian churches, and other structures. The builders sometimes incorporated these earlier elements into their new construction, creating buildings that physically embodied the history of their sites. The international character of cathedral building is evident in the widespread exchange of techniques and ideas across medieval Europe. Master builders traveled from project to project, carrying knowledge and innovations with them. The similarity of construction techniques across different regions reflects this exchange, while local variations show how universal principles were adapted to local conditions and materials. The movement of skilled craftsmen created a network of knowledge exchange that spread innovations rapidly throughout Europe. The development of Gothic architecture was a truly international phenomenon, with innovations developed in one region quickly spreading to others. The pointed arch, which became characteristic of Gothic design, was developed from Islamic architecture and adapted to European conditions. The flying buttress system was refined through experiments at many different sites, with each project contributing to the overall understanding of how these structural elements could be used most effectively. The symbolic significance of cathedral construction was as important as its practical aspects, with every element of the building carrying religious and symbolic meaning. These buildings were intended to represent the heavenly Jerusalem on earth, with every element carefully designed to support this symbolic program. The orientation of the building, the proportions of its parts, and the subjects of its decoration all reflected theological concepts that were central to medieval Christianity. The builders understood that they were creating not just functional structures, but also vehicles for spiritual expression. The symbolic program of a cathedral was usually developed by the clergy who sponsored the construction, working closely with the master builder to ensure that the building would effectively communicate its religious message. The iconographic program of the building was carefully planned, with every carved element and stained glass window contributing to the overall theological message. The builders were expected to understand and implement this symbolic program, creating buildings that were both architecturally sophisticated and theologically meaningful. The development of specialized construction techniques for cathedral building led to innovations that had applications far beyond religious architecture. The lifting devices, scaffolding systems, and stone-cutting techniques developed for cathedrals were adapted for use in castle construction, bridge building, and other large-scale projects. The organizational methods used to coordinate cathedral construction provided models for other complex undertakings, from military campaigns to commercial enterprises. The influence of cathedral construction techniques extended to secular architecture, with the same craftsmen who worked on cathedrals also building castles, civic buildings, and private residences. The skills developed in cathedral construction were transferred to these other projects, improving the quality and sophistication of secular architecture. The structural systems developed for cathedrals were adapted for use in other types of buildings, creating a tradition of skilled construction that benefited all types of architecture. The decline of cathedral building in the later Middle Ages was due to a combination of factors, including changes in religious practice, economic disruption, and the development of new architectural styles. The techniques and traditions that had been developed over centuries of cathedral construction were gradually lost, as fewer projects were undertaken, and the guild system that had trained skilled craftsmen began to decline. The knowledge that had been passed down through generations of master builders was in danger of being lost forever. The economic disruptions of the later Middle Ages, including the Black Death and various wars, reduced the resources available for cathedral construction. The changing nature of religious practice also reduced the demand for new cathedral construction, as the emphasis shifted from building new churches to maintaining existing ones. The rise of new architectural styles, such as Renaissance architecture, also contributed to the decline of Gothic construction techniques. The rediscovery of medieval construction techniques during the Gothic revival of the 19th century led to renewed appreciation for the skills of medieval builders. Architects and craftsmen studied surviving examples of medieval work, attempting to understand and recreate the techniques that had been used. This revival led to the construction of new buildings using traditional methods, as well as the restoration of existing medieval structures using historically appropriate techniques. The Gothic revival movement was driven by romantic idealization of the Middle Ages, but it also represented a genuine attempt to understand and preserve medieval building techniques. The architects and craftsmen of the revival studied medieval buildings carefully, measuring and documenting construction details that had been ignored for centuries. This scholarly approach to understanding medieval construction laid the foundation for modern conservation practice. The modern study of medieval construction techniques has been enhanced by new technologies that allow researchers to examine structures in ways that were not previously possible. Ground-penetrating radar can reveal the details of foundation construction without excavation, while laser scanning can create precise measurements of complex architectural elements. These new tools have provided insights into medieval construction that would have been impossible to achieve through traditional archaeological methods. The use of computer analysis has allowed researchers to understand the structural behavior of medieval buildings in ways that were not possible before. Finite element analysis can reveal how loads are distributed through complex structures, while computer modeling can test the effects of different construction techniques. These analytical tools have confirmed that medieval builders achieved remarkable structural efficiency using only empirical knowledge and practical experience. The conservation of medieval cathedrals presents ongoing challenges that require both traditional skills and modern understanding. The stone used in cathedral construction is subject to weathering and pollution damage that threatens the long-term survival of these buildings. Conservation efforts must balance the need to preserve original materials with the requirement to maintain structural integrity and weather resistance. The development of new conservation techniques requires understanding of both traditional construction methods and modern materials science. The challenge of pollution damage to medieval stonework has become increasingly serious in recent decades, with acid rain and other pollutants accelerating the deterioration of stone surfaces. Conservation specialists have developed new techniques for cleaning and protecting stone surfaces, but these methods must be compatible with the original construction techniques. The use of modern materials in conservation work requires careful testing to ensure that they will not cause damage to the historic fabric. The training of craftsmen to work on historic buildings has become increasingly important as the need for conservation and restoration work has grown. Traditional apprenticeship programs have been revived to teach the skills needed to work with historic materials and techniques. These programs often combine traditional training methods with modern understanding of materials, science, and structural engineering, creating craftsmen who can work effectively with both old and new materials. The revival of traditional building skills has created new opportunities for craftsmen who specialize in historic construction techniques. These specialists work not only on medieval cathedrals, but also on other historic buildings, using their understanding of traditional techniques to maintain and restore structures that were built using pre-industrial methods. The demand for these skills has grown as awareness of the importance of preserving historic buildings has increased. The economic impact of cathedral construction in medieval society was enormous, involving not only the direct costs of materials and labor, but also the indirect effects on local economies. The presence of a major construction project attracted merchants, craftsmen, and other service providers, creating economic opportunities that could transform entire regions. The legacy of this economic activity can still be seen in the prosperity of many former cathedral towns, which developed thriving economies based on the skilled crafts that were needed for cathedral construction. The concentration of skilled craftsmen in cathedral towns created centers of technical innovation and artistic excellence that influenced developments far beyond the construction sites themselves. These towns became known for the quality of their craftsmanship, attracting commissions from distant patrons and developing reputations that persisted long after the cathedrals were completed. The skills developed in cathedral construction were applied to other types of work, creating industries that provided employment for generations of skilled workers. The technological innovations developed for cathedral construction had lasting effects on European civilization, contributing to the overall advancement of European technology and engineering capability. The improvements in lifting devices, transportation methods, and construction techniques that were developed for religious buildings were eventually applied to secular projects, contributing to the development of European infrastructure and building technology. The organizational methods developed for cathedral construction provided models for other large-scale projects, from military engineering to commercial enterprises. The development of new tools and techniques for cathedral construction contributed to the advancement of metallurgy, carpentry, and other crafts that were essential to medieval civilization. The demand for high-quality tools created markets for skilled metalworkers, while the need for complex wooden structures advanced the art of carpentry. The techniques developed for quarrying and transporting stone were applied to other construction projects, improving the quality and efficiency of all types of building work. The spiritual and emotional impact of cathedral construction extended far beyond the buildings themselves, creating communities of faith and craftsmanship that transformed medieval society. The process of creating these magnificent structures was seen as a form of prayer and devotion, with craftsmen viewing their work as a service to God. The completion of a cathedral was often accompanied by a sense of community achievement that strengthened social bonds and religious commitment, creating lasting effects that extended far beyond the construction period. The sense of community purpose that cathedral construction created was remarkable, bringing together people from all social classes in a common endeavor. The wealthy contributed funds, the skilled craftsmen contributed their expertise, and the common people contributed their labor, all working together toward a shared goal. This collaboration created bonds of mutual respect and common purpose that strengthened medieval communities and contributed to their social cohesion. The documentation of cathedral construction projects has provided historians with invaluable insights into medieval society, economy, and technology. The detailed records kept by cathedral builders include information about wages, working conditions, material costs, and construction techniques that would otherwise be lost to history. These records provide a window into the daily life of medieval craftsmen and the operation of medieval institutions, revealing aspects of medieval civilization that are not documented in other sources. The financial records of cathedral construction projects are particularly valuable, providing detailed information about the medieval economy and the costs of materials and labor. These records show how cathedral projects were financed, how costs were controlled, and how resources were allocated among different aspects of the construction. The accounting methods used in cathedral construction were often sophisticated, providing models for other types of financial management. The influence of cathedral architecture extended far beyond Europe. As European colonization and missionary activity spread Gothic architectural principles to other parts of the world. The techniques and aesthetic principles developed for European cathedrals were adapted for use in different climates and with different materials, creating new architectural traditions that reflected both European influence and local conditions. The global spread of Gothic architecture created an architectural language that was recognized and understood across many different cultures. The adaptation of Gothic principles to different climates and materials created interesting variations in cathedral design, with builders learning to modify traditional techniques to work with local conditions. The use of different types of stone, the adaptation to different weather patterns, and the incorporation of local decorative traditions created regional variations that enriched the overall Gothic tradition while maintaining its essential characteristics. The study of medieval construction techniques has practical applications for modern building projects, particularly in the area of sustainable construction. The durability of medieval buildings, achieved using only local materials and human power, provides lessons for modern architects seeking to create buildings that have minimal environmental impact while providing centuries of service. The use of traditional materials and techniques can create buildings that are both environmentally responsible and culturally appropriate. The sustainability of medieval construction techniques is increasingly relevant as modern society seeks to reduce its environmental impact. The use of local materials, the employment of human and animal power, and the creation of buildings that last for centuries all provide models for sustainable construction that could be adapted for modern use. The efficiency of medieval construction, achieved without the use of fossil fuels or modern machinery, demonstrates that high-quality buildings can be created using environmentally friendly methods. The psychological effects of cathedral spaces have been studied by modern researchers, who have found that the proportions and lighting of Gothic interiors can indeed produce measurable changes in human mood and behavior. The medieval builders' intuitive understanding of how architectural spaces affect human psychology has been confirmed by modern scientific investigation, revealing that the builders achieved their effects through careful manipulation of scale, proportion, and lighting. The research into the psychological effects of cathedral spaces has revealed that these buildings were designed not just for practical functions but also to create specific emotional and spiritual responses in their users. The soaring heights, the play of light and shadow, and the complex geometric patterns all work together to create environments that inspire contemplation and spiritual reflection. The builders achieved these effects through careful attention to the human experience of architectural space. The preservation of traditional building skills has become increasingly important as the World Heritage value of medieval cathedrals has been recognized. International efforts to maintain and restore these buildings have led to programs that train craftsmen in traditional techniques and support the continued production of traditional building materials. These efforts ensure that the skills needed to maintain medieval buildings will not be lost, preserving both the buildings themselves and the knowledge needed to care for them. The international cooperation in preserving medieval cathedrals has created networks of skilled craftsmen and conservation specialists who share knowledge and techniques across national boundaries. These networks ensure that the best practices in cathedral conservation are shared widely, improving the quality of conservation work and preserving the buildings for future generations. The exchange of knowledge and techniques continues the medieval tradition of international cooperation in cathedral construction. The mathematical principles underlying Gothic architecture have been studied extensively by modern mathematicians and architects, who have found sophisticated geometric relationships that demonstrate the advanced mathematical knowledge of medieval builders. These studies have revealed that the apparently intuitive designs of Gothic cathedrals were based on precise mathematical principles that ensured both structural stability and aesthetic harmony. The builders achieved these sophisticated results using simple geometric construction techniques that could be performed with basic tools. The study of Gothic geometry has revealed that medieval builders understood mathematical relationships that were not formally described until centuries later. The proportional systems used in Gothic design were based on geometric principles that created harmonious relationships between different parts of the building. These proportional systems were not arbitrary, but were carefully chosen to create both structural efficiency and aesthetic beauty. The environmental lessons of cathedral construction remain relevant today, as modern builders seek to create structures that will last for centuries with minimal maintenance. The durability of medieval cathedrals, achieved through careful material selection and construction techniques, provides a model for sustainable construction that is increasingly important in an era of environmental concern. The use of local materials, traditional techniques, and skilled craftsmanship created buildings that have required minimal maintenance over their centuries of existence. The longevity of medieval cathedrals demonstrates that well-designed and well-built structures can provide centuries of service with minimal resource consumption. The buildings continue to serve their original purposes nearly 1,000 years after their construction, requiring only periodic maintenance and repair. This longevity provides a model for sustainable construction that contrasts sharply with the disposable architecture of the modern era. As we reflect on the extraordinary achievement of medieval cathedral builders, we are reminded of the power of human dedication and skill, working together toward a common goal. These magnificent structures, built stone by stone over decades and centuries, stand as monuments to the possibility of great achievement through patient effort and skilled craftsmanship. The builders who created them worked without modern tools or machinery, relying instead on their knowledge, their skill, and their unwavering commitment to their craft. The legacy of these ancient builders continues to inspire and instruct us today, demonstrating that the greatest achievements often come through the patient application of skill and dedication, rather than through technological innovation alone. Their techniques, refined over centuries of practice, demonstrated that magnificent structures could be created using only the simplest of tools and the most basic of materials. Their organizational methods showed how complex projects could be coordinated and completed over long periods of time. Their dedication to excellence created buildings that have withstood the test of time and continue to inspire wonder and admiration nearly 1,000 years after their construction. In our modern world of advanced technology and rapid construction, the patient work of medieval cathedral builders offers a different model of achievement, one based on careful planning, skilled execution, and unwavering commitment to quality. Their success came not from speed or efficiency, but from understanding that great achievements require time, that excellence cannot be rushed, and that the most lasting monuments are built through the accumulated efforts of many skilled hands working toward a common goal. The cathedrals they built continue to serve their communities today, providing spaces for worship, contemplation, and celebration, just as they did when they were first completed centuries ago. The stone walls that medieval masons laid with such care still support the soaring vaults overhead. The carved details that craftsmen created with simple chisels still delight visitors with their beauty and complexity. The stained glass windows that medieval artisans assembled piece by piece still fill the interiors with colored light that transforms throughout the day. These enduring monuments remind us that the most important achievements in human history have often been accomplished through the patient application of skill and dedication, rather than through technological innovation alone. The cathedral builders of medieval Europe created some of the most beautiful and enduring structures in human history, using nothing more than stone, timber, iron, and human ingenuity. Their legacy continues to inspire us to reach for excellence in our own work, to value craftsmanship and dedication, and to remember that the greatest achievements often require the greatest patience. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let your mind rest on the image of these patient craftsmen, working day after day, year after year, to create something beautiful and lasting. Let their dedication to excellence inspire your own efforts, and let their achievement remind you that great things are possible when human skill and patience are combined with a worthy goal. The cathedrals they built continue to reach toward the heavens, testament to the power of human creativity and the enduring value of work done with care and skill. In the quiet darkness of night, these ancient stones continue their silent vigil, monuments to the possibility of human achievement and the lasting power of skilled hands working together in common purpose.